Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fitaurus Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fitaurus. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this Saturday we have In the Hunt, the 1993 Irem submarine shoot 'em up classic. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. Originally released to arcades in 1993 by developer Irem, In the Hunt would later be ported to the PlayStation, the Saturn, and the PC. Now, in 2019, as part of Hamster's arcade archives, In the Hunt is available for the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 4. So this title is different from your standard Irem shoot 'em ups. It's got a very different feel than R-Type and the other games in that series, and the other shoot 'em ups that they happen to have made as well. And it's one that I can definitely recommend playing, but it does have some issues. So today, we're going to be looking at actually the Japanese ROM. So here we find ourselves at the Arcade Archives title screen. We can either load up the English version, which is the one I usually show off, and the Japanese version, which is the one we'll be playing today. Also, as part of the other Arcade Archive options, we have the high score mode, where you set as high of a score as possible in one continue, and the Caravan mode, where you set as high of a score as possible in 5 minutes. As we start up the ROMs, we get a quick little control overview, and then we dive into the game. And one thing I do like about Hamster's Arcade Archives is they actually have a really good manual, so be sure to check that out. Don't worry about this warning, it's not a crime to be playing this ROM, 100% legal, although it is kind of amusing that it is there. So here we are at the title screen for In the Hunt, the Japanese version. We're going to dive right into the game itself. Stage 1, the South Pole. So, real quick backstory. This takes place in the somewhat distant future where an organization that we're actually fighting against, DAS, ended up destroying 80% of the landmass on planet Earth. Now, fast forward 83 years after that apocalypse, and that organization is at it again, looking to conquer the world / destroy the world, and we're, as an experimental prototype submarine, have been tasked with stopping their ambitions. So I actually like the name of the sub. It's the Fiber Grampus, or as it's known for short, the Grandia. So it's funner to go and just call it the Grampus, but whatever. And there's actually 2 versions, the female version and the male version. I don't really know why it's necessary to note that, or at least that's what the manual says. And player 1 is the female version, the player 2 is the male version. So right off the bat, you can see that it's a horizontal scrolling shoot 'em up. There are a couple things that are rather unique about this horizontal scrolling, though. The fact is, you can control the rate of the scrolling. Never in the game is it forcing you to scroll at a pace that you're not setting. So if you want to advance the screen to the right, you just move to the right. If you want to take things really slowly, then you just stop, wait, and take your time taking out the enemies. There's no bonuses for time, but there is a time limit for every life you have, which is displayed in the bottom middle of the screen. So that's your reason for maybe pushing forward faster than might be safe. So let's talk a little bit about our attacks. So as a submarine, we have our forward attack, which just happens to be the torpedoes, and we also have a vertical attack. The vertical attack is rather unique, as it has 2 different forms depending on if we're submerged or if we happen to surface the sub. So if we're submerged, it will, depending on which weapon we have equipped, it will fire missiles or mines above us and depth charges below us. If we happen to surface the ship, then we'll be firing machine guns, or a more powerful version of the machine guns, or we'll also have the ability to pick up power-ups that would give us missiles or homing missiles as well. Just trying to play things safe. We can pick up several different power-ups for both the torpedoes as well as the vertical attack. So this particular upgrade that we picked up for the torpedoes is the Supersonic. So the torpedoes fire with a supersonic shockwave that follows after them, and that shockwave can deal damage to the enemies that might happen to crash into that shockwave. Oh, so this section's pretty neat. These ice beams that freeze us, not only freeze us, but if an enemy sub happened to pass through them as well, then those subs get frozen as well. That's something I really like, when something that affects the player will also affect the enemy in the same way. Though that's the only point in the game that we actually see that particular trick. So if you wait long enough, the power-ups do swap between the two different forms. So let's see if we can get a different form for our torpedo. So this is the cracker torpedo, which happens to be the one I like the best, although sometimes its usage is actually like well, it doesn't have the best usage, so it doesn't travel the entire distance of the screen. And this boss here can be one of those ones that we can have problems with because of that. It'll travel a certain distance. The torpedoes, rather, will travel a certain distance across the screen, explode, and then fire a whole bunch of smaller bombs. So basically it's a cluster bomb missile that will deal quite a bit of damage to any enemies they happen to hit. So against certain bosses, they're very, very effective. Against the boss in the first stage, not so much. So in addition to the supersonic and the cracker torpedoes, we also have just normal torpedoes, a standard issue, and we can continue to power those up. After we complete the stage, we get a tally of how many enemies we took out, as well as a stamp for the boss that we defeated. So one thing that's interesting about the Japanese version versus the English version, and which is the reason I chose to play the Japanese version, is that the versions are not the same as far as which stages we play through. So in the Japanese version, the stage, or rather, so if we look at the English version as being stages 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the way the Japanese version plays is 1, 3, 5, 2, 4. So depending on which stages you're looking to play would depend on which versions you want to, or rather which version you want to play. And as far as showing off what the game has to offer, I think it's easier to play the Japanese version. Also, the Japanese version, strangely enough, seems to be the one that's slightly easier. So as I noted earlier, we have a slightly different attack with our vertical when we are on the surface of the water rather than when we're submerged. So this stage shows that off really well, as a lot of the stage we're just riding right along the surface, dealing with these enemies that are above the water. If we have the powered up weapons, it's significantly easier to deal with those enemies, as just the main machine gun is not very helpful since it only fires straight up. So one thing I definitely feel this game has is incredible art, although that art comes at a price. So this was released on the Irem M92 arcade hardware, and it really pushes that hardware to the limit. And even in the ports for the consoles, it would see significant slowdown. You're kind of seeing that right now. The game supports 2 players as well, but part of the reason I'm not playing it that way is just to minimize the amount of slowdown that's present in the game itself. So this section here, we have to destroy that little bomb, and that train that's above us will come crashing down. So this is something I haven't talked about. So there's these little treasure capsules throughout the game, and each time you destroy them, they'll open up to reveal these treasure balls. Collect 100 of them, and you gain a 1-up. Unfortunately, there are only a finite number in the game, so collecting 100 is one of those things that in a full playthrough you're likely only going to do once. If you're really, really thorough about catching, or rather collecting them all, sorry, I've been playing a little bit too much Pokemon recently. If you're really thorough about collecting them all, you might be able to get 2 1-ups in one playthrough. So this boss is kind of interesting. So we have to initially shoot him down from his perch above us, and then once he's in the water, we'll be able to deal significantly more damage to this particular boss. We do have to be careful though. Those laser beams, although they don't normally reach into the surface, they do have a secondary attack that will hit us under the waves. Bam. Now that he's in the water, like, he's more easier for us to hit, but the fight still can go badly. So there you have it. In the Hunt, served up for your enjoyment. As far as my quick impressions of the game, it's definitely one that's well worth playing, but it does have its issues. So diving into the minus flavors. The first minus flavor is the one I discussed earlier in the stage, and that's the slowdown. So especially in some of the later stages, the slowdown gets to be a really big problem. And then this is more of a minor complaint on my part, but the hitbox is almost the entire submarine, which can be frustrating, as there are some areas where you have to sneak through tight enemy formations, and when your sub is as large as it is, that can be very, very difficult to do. So this stage is very, very interesting. Although the game itself is a horizontal scrolling shoot 'em up, there's this stage where we're actually moving vertically and running away from this golem which is pursuing us. Although, here's a quick thing to note, the golem's not actually that big of a threat. If you're not moving forward, the golem will just sit there and wait for you to move up. You will fire these air bubbles, but all those do is push you up. They don't actually deal any damage. The main threat we encounter come from the enemies, and well, these mines are also a very big threat. So we have to be careful about that. The golem actually isn't that big of a problem till we come to the end of the stage, though the stage is relatively short, so we will get there rather shortly. So in this section we have to blast our way through these stones. Anyway, back to the minus flavors. So we've got the problem with the slowdown, we've got the problem with having a rather large hitbox. The other problem is the game doesn't have much replayability. It's relatively short at just 6 stages, and with there not being much variance, with the Arcade Archive release, you can play the English version or you can play the Japanese version. That creates a little bit of variance to your experience, but for the most part, it's not going to be that different playing one version or the other. But as far as plus flavors are concerned, I feel that the pixel art in this game is just absolutely phenomenally gorgeous. So you've got all those effects with the water and the enemy shots and your shots. There's just like so much, and even in this particular fight, you've got the blocks, and this way that we actually fight the boss is awesome. You have to use your vertical shot to knock these blocks down, and then the blocks will fall onto the boss, dealing damage. Just all of the pixel art, this makes for a really stunning experience. And this team would later leave Irem and go on to develop the Metal Slug series for SNK. You can kind of see some of that art style here in these titles. And then the other plus flavor is just the unique feel this has. So especially with it being a title from Irem, it doesn't feel like an Irem shoot 'em up. And even then, there aren't really any other shoot 'em ups that it feels like. There are some other ones where you're in a submarine underwater, like most recently like Earth Atlantis, which that one had its issues as well, but for the most part, this title has a very unique feel that there's not really anything out there like it. So even if it's short and doesn't have a lot of replayability, it's one that I feel is worth playing for the experience of having played this title. Alright, that'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for coming out and joining me this week, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.